There's been a lot of funny talk lately about Canada becoming the 51st state of America. And it's got me thinking, if this were to happen, if we were to just erase this line right here and make it one big country, just how strong would it be? Well, let's take a look at it, starting with its sheer grandiosity. Canada is the world's second largest country, boasting a massive 3.85 million square miles of total area, while the US isn't far behind at fourth place with 3.67 million. But combined, they'd form an absolute behemoth of geography, 7.66 million square miles strong, leaving even the reigning champion, Russia, at 6.6 million square miles in the dust. Their population would be a combined 380 million people, which, well, would still be the world's third most populated country. Now, economically, the US is already by far the strongest economy on Earth, with a GDP of $30 trillion, far away from second place China's at $19 trillion. Then we combine Canada's $2 trillion GDP for a combined total of $32 trillion. But the thing is, if a merger did happen, there are ways in which the combined GDP would increase even more. In fact, I'd say it's almost guaranteed. See, the US and Canada already have quite a close economic relationship. Canada is the United States' largest trading partner. Over $2.7 billion in goods and services cross the border every day. If combined, this economic activity could become even more seamless. Customs delays would be eliminated, as would things like tariffs, processing, and certain regulatory mismatches between the two countries. Mismatches like agricultural and food safety standards, energy and environmental policies, and transport and logistics. But where this country would really gain strength in is essentially the US being able to harness all the natural resources that Canada has, which is a lot. The United States is the world's largest producer of petroleum and natural gas, and it could use its technological edge and infrastructure to better access Canada's reserves. Take the Athabasca tar sands in Alberta, for example. It's one of the world's largest crude oil deposits. They currently produce approximately 2.8 million barrels of oil per day and are part of a broader Canadian oil output of over 5.3 million barrels per day by the end of 2024. Canada exports 81% of its oil, and of those exports, 97% go to the US, 4 million barrels per day as of 2023. Most of that goes through the 31 oil pipelines that cross the US-Canada border. Without that border, there's potential to expand these pipelines, as well as the potential to increase production at the Athabasca tar sands, since the US is more lax than Canada in its environmental regulations when it comes to extracting oil, for better or worse, and has the tech to extract it more efficiently. Without a border, these pipelines would become more integrated. Expansions could be built with fewer regulatory hurdles and paperwork and international red tape type stuff. This is the point here. Unified decision-making. A merger would place all the oil and gas in Canada and the US under a single political and regulatory framework. This means countries like China and India would have to negotiate with a consolidated superpower rather than two separate entities, increasing North America's leverage. And this consolidated power would have a lot of oil and natural gas. It'd pump out 6.6 billion barrels of oil and 41.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas per year. This would far surpass Saudi Arabia, which produces 3.8 billion barrels of oil and 13.6 trillion cubic feet of natural gas per year, and Russia, which produces 4 billion barrels of oil and 24 trillion cubic feet of natural gas per year. This dominance in both oil and natural gas markets would make the combined entity the world's most formidable energy superpower, reshaping global energy dynamics and challenging the geopolitical influence of major producers like OPEC. Then there's access to Pacific markets. One of the most important pipelines in North America might become this one, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which currently runs from Edmonton to Vancouver. The pipeline is currently increasing its capacity to 890,000 barrels per day and provides a direct route to ports on Canada's west coast, from which oil can be shipped across the Pacific. Combined with the US's existing energy export facilities on the Gulf Coast, a unified North America could flood Asian markets, offering reliable supply chains to energy-hungry nations like China and India. The introduction of North America into the Asian market would also create price competition. potentially lowering global crude prices and reducing the revenue streams that sustain petrostate economies. However, increased competition might provoke retaliation, such as production cuts or more aggressive moves to deepen ties with emerging markets like Southeast Asia and Africa, escalating global energy rivalries. Besides just fossil fuel natural resources, Canada also has lots of mineral resources. The US does too, but Canada has quite a few minerals that the US barely has. For example, they're the world's leading producer of potassium, also known as potash. They're the second largest producer of uranium in the world, third in diamond production, fourth in cobalt production, and sixth in nickel production, just to name a few. All these things the US fairly lacks in, showing the type of new dimension Canada can open up if the countries merged. Agriculture is another big thing in this. Canada's sprawling prairies already rank among the world's top agricultural regions. They produce huge quantities of wheat, canola, and barley. Canada's 160 million acres of farmland would be merged with the United States' 880 million acres to create a super farm state with over 1 billion acres of arable land, the most in the world by far. Coming in second would be China at 316 million acres. Based on current numbers, that land would produce a combined 130 million tons of soy, 75 million tons of wheat, and 392 million tons of corn, just to name a few things. In total, the agricultural sector would be worth $2.2 trillion, second only to China's, whose agricultural sector has a net worth of $2.6 trillion. But these numbers are set to increase, and increase quite a lot potentially, thanks in large part to climate change. Canada's warming at nearly twice the global average thanks to what's known as Arctic amplification, where warming in polar regions occurs more intensely than elsewhere. Because of this, the country's agricultural potential is transforming quite dramatically. Tens of millions of acres, if not hundreds of millions, will become sustainable for farming in the boreal north of Canada in the coming decades. These changes would allow crops to be grown in areas that used to be impossible due to the cold. Even under moderate warming, a US-Canada megastate would dominate the global food supply. Countries reliant on imported grains and livestock feed, countries like Egypt, Indonesia, and even parts of Europe, could find themselves negotiating with a single agricultural titan. Access to food, especially in an era of climate instability, would become a bargaining chip of unparalleled value. Speaking of the effects of climate change, the potential for a fully functioning Northwest Passage, a passage that spans 900 miles and joins the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Canada-Arctic archipelago, is also something that would be of huge geopolitical benefits. And a merger between the US and Canada would mean definitive, stress-free control of it. See, while the passage is obviously in Canada's internal waters, making it solely their waterway to control, as per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, it hasn't stopped many countries, mainly the US, from denying that it belongs to them, claiming that it's an international strait because it connects two major bodies of water and should be able to be crossed freely by all NATO vessels, as it states in the Law of the Freedom of Navigation. While Canada would obviously let the US use it, being a merged country means that there's no more debate about this, freeing up any potential issues. The other problem that'd be solved is the lack of infrastructure. It's extremely hard to build anything that far north. It's very remote and developing the region would be tough, even with more of the ice melting out of the way. Currently, in the Canadian North, where much of the Northwest Passage flows, there's only 2 developed deep-water ports. The Port of Churchill, located in Churchill, Manitoba, which is the only one with any sort of rail access to southern Canada, and the Iqaluit Deepwater Port. So the infrastructure is barely built up. But if Canada was part of the US, it's quite obvious that the world's richest country would begin to make much more dramatic investments into the region to develop it. And this is an extremely important route. I mean, it's been known about for centuries. It just hasn't been able to be taken advantage of because it's always too covered in sea ice to be used for regular marine shipping during most of the year. But with global warming, unfortunately, this is all changing. Since 1979, the Arctic sea ice has declined by 40%, with NASA saying it's currently disappearing at a rate of 13% per decade, meaning the passage is becoming increasingly navigable. The unified control over the passage would amplify North America's ability to influence global trade flows. For example, transporting something from Shanghai to New York, two megacities, would take about 10,500 nautical miles through the Panama Canal, which is currently the best and most convenient option for maritime shipping from Asia to the US East Coast. However, that same journey through the Northwest Passage could be just 8,600 nautical miles, potentially saving 7 days of travel time. This passageway connects East Asia and America's East Coast far better than the Panama Canal, which handles 5% of total oceanic shipping, or $270 billion in cargo crossings each year, while even increasing the amount of cargo per transit by 25% because the Arctic route isn't constrained by the same size and depth limits that the Panama Canal is. As we know, countries which have rights to the world's most important shipping routes have been able to use it to their significant advantage, from Egypt's Suez Canal to Singapore's Malacca Strait. There's also the Northeast Passage, which Russia has undisputed ownership of. So not having undisputed control of the Northwest Passage means a geopolitical loss for the US. But one thing's for sure, geopolitical tensions in the Arctic would be higher than ever. And this is where we lastly talk about the military. Obviously, the addition of Canada's military is quite a minor thing given the United States' already unparalleled strength. The US military currently has around 1.3 million active personnel and an almost $900 billion defense budget, a budget that accounts for nearly 40% of global military spending. Its arsenal includes over 13,000 aircrafts, 11 aircraft carriers, and a nuclear arsenal of 5,428 warheads. Canada's military is, of course, a lot smaller. It's made up of just 68,000 active personnel, 2,400 armored vehicles, and 12 surface ships, with a defense budget of just $27 billion. But hey, it's still something. Now, I want to take this point at near the end of the video to talk about what we're all wondering. What about politically? How would this work? Canada's system is designed around a prime minister, drawn from the parliamentary majority, while the US uses a presidential system with separate executive and legislative branches. Well, obviously, when there's talk about a merger between the US and Canada, it's under the assumption that the US would be absorbing Canada, which makes sense. How exactly Canada would be absorbed, though, is the mystery. President Trump, of course, has talked about it becoming the quote 51st state of America, but this doesn't seem realistic. I mean, a landmass that large solely being one state, not to mention it'd become the most populous state in the US right off the bat. It just doesn't seem likely. Another way this could go down is just by turning 9 of Canada's 10 provinces into states, with Prince Edward's Island probably becoming a territory. It's already divided into these areas anyway. There'd be 58 states in all, 18 more senators, and countless more representatives. Now, whether Canada ends up as just one state or 9, this political representation they'll have in Congress will undoubtedly change things. Even though Canada's Liberal Party has undoubtedly fallen out of favor and the country is set to vote Conservative, the vast majority of Canadians aren't actually right-wing in the way that America is. In fact, the Canadian right would probably be seen as a left-wing party in the US. In the presidential elections, unless the GOP shifts left in some of its policies, then the Democrats would win them every time for a long, long time, given how many electoral votes Canada would be worth thanks to its centers like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal being very progressive. Essentially, Canada would be serving as a second, stronger California. This would be reflected as well in Congress. 18 senators coming from Canada would heavily tilt Congress in the Democrats' favor for possibly decades. Or if there's just 2, it'd still be a free 2 Senate seats. On the House level, keeping the chamber at 435 members means reapportionment would give Canada at least 45 seats from a host of states, giving the Dems an undisputed advantage here too. Lastly, there's Quebec to account for. Now, undoubtedly, with a merger of the US and Canada, there is absolutely no way that Quebec doesn't push the hardest they've ever done for an independent Quebec. And that's because, simply put, Quebecois culture wouldn't be able to survive being integrated into the largest Anglosphere country. And they know that. Stuff like KFC or Kentucky Fried Chicken being forced into being called Poulet Frit Kentucky, its French version by Quebec's language laws, simply would not stand in the US. This means that Quebec would most likely fall culturally, just like Louisiana's French heritage or New Mexico's Spanish heritage. In the end, a combined US and Canada is probably just a pipe dream, or a pipe nightmare depending on who you ask. But who knows? Borders have changed all the time throughout history. Maybe we'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. I'll see you in the next one.